Margaret had learned long ago that sometimes the best place to hide was in plain sight. She had been working at the officers' club for 3 months now, serving meals to the generals and colonels who gathered there each evening. The work was honest, and it paid enough to help her get by after losing her husband Harold the year before. The other servers were mostly younger women who chattered about their weekend plans and their boyfriends. Margaret listened with a gentle smile, but rarely joined, and she preferred the quiet rhythm of her work, the careful folding of napkins, the polishing of silver, the way the late afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the dining room. None of them knew about the small silver medal she kept tucked away in her jewelry box at home, the silver star that Harold had insisted she display on their mantelpiece for 20 years until his passing. When she packed up their house to move to the smaller apartment, she had wrapped it carefully in tissue paper and placed it in the bottom drawer. She told herself it belonged to a different time, a different version of herself. The generals barely noticed her as she moved between the tables, refilling water glasses and clearing plates. She had become part of the furniture in the way that happens when you serve others quietly and competently. General Morrison, with his thick gray mustache, always ordered the same meal. General Patterson, who spoke in clipped sentences about budget allocations. General Hayes, who had a habit of checking his pocket watch throughout dinner. Margaret found a strange comfort in their predictability. It reminded her of the hospital routines she had known so well during those difficult months in Vietnam. The way certain procedures became automatic, the way you could move through your duties, even when your heart was heavy with worry for the soldiers under your care. She had been a nurse then, Lieutenant Margaret Catherine Mills, fresh out of training and determined to make a difference. The field hospital where she served had been a place of chaos and miracles, where young men arrived broken and left whole, or sometimes didn't leave at all. She had worked 18-hour shifts during the worst of it, holding hands with frightened boys who called for their mothers, cleaning wounds that made her stomach turn, but never letting it show. The Silver Star had come after that terrible night when the hospital came under fire. She still remembered the sound of the shells whistling overhead, the way the ground shook beneath her feet. Most of the staff had taken cover in the reinforced bunker, but Margaret had stayed with 3 critical patients who couldn't be moved. She had continued their IV drips in the dark, working by feel when the generator failed, talking to them in gentle voices even when she wasn't sure they could hear her. When morning came, and the all-clear sounded, she had saved all 3 of them. The medal ceremony had felt surreal, standing there in her freshly pressed uniform, while some colonel read words about valor and dedication. Harold had been so proud when she told him the story years later after they were married. He said she was the bravest person he had ever known, but that was 40 years ago now, and Margaret Mills had become Margaret Henderson. And then after Harold's death, she had gone back to using her maiden name, Margaret Catherine Mills, once again. The young woman who had earned that Silver Star felt like someone from a history book, someone she had read about rather than someone she had been. On this particular Tuesday evening, the dining room was busier than usual. There was talk of a visiting delegation, and the generals seemed more formal than usual, adjusting their dress uniforms and speaking in lowered voices. Margaret noticed General Morrison checking his reflection in the polished surface of the water pitcher, and General Patterson straightening his medals. She was refilling coffee cups when she heard General Hayes mention Vietnam. He was speaking to a younger officer about the challenges of field medicine during wartime. Margaret's hand trembled slightly, and she had to steady herself against the table. The nurses were remarkable. General Hayes was saying, "I remember this one field hospital where I was stationed briefly after taking shrapnel. The head nurse there was something special. She stayed with the wounded during an artillery attack, never left their side. The whole staff talked about her for months afterward." Margaret continued her work, but her ears were tuned to every word the younger officer asked about casualties and medical procedures. And General Hayes continued his story with the careful precision of someone who had told it many times before. "Lieutenant Mills was her name," he said, and Margaret nearly dropped the coffee pot. "Margaret Mills, I believe, earned a Silver Star that night, saved 3 lives while shells were falling all around them. Never saw courage like that before or since." The coffee cup rattled against the saucer as Margaret set it down. Her heart was beating so fast, she was afraid someone might notice. She glanced around the room, but no one was looking at her. The conversation continued, but she found it hard to focus on the words. She excused herself and walked quickly to the kitchen where she stood with her back against the cool metal door of the walk-in cooler. Her hands were shaking, and she pressed them against her apron, trying to steady herself after all these years to hear her story, told by someone who had been there, someone who remembered. When she returned to the dining room, General Hayes was alone at his table, the younger officer having been called away. He looked up as she approached with the coffee pot, and for a moment their eyes met. Really met in a way that hadn't happened in all the months she had been serving him. "More coffee, sir?" she asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. He nodded and held out his cup as she poured. He studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. She could see the wheels turning in his mind, the way he was cataloging her features, comparing them to some memory. "Forgive me," he said quietly, "but you remind me of someone I knew a long time ago, a nurse in Vietnam." Margaret's hand trembled again, and this time a few drops of coffee splashed onto the white tablecloth. She quickly reached for her cleaning cloth, but General Hayes caught her wrist gently. "Margaret Mills," he said, and it wasn't a question. She looked into his eyes and saw recognition there along with something else. Respect, perhaps even a kind of reverence. She had forgotten what that felt like, to be seen not just as the woman who refilled water glasses, but as the person she had been, the things she had done. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "Though it's been many years since anyone called me that." He released her wrist and leaned back in his chair, studying her with wonder. "Lieutenant Mills, the Silver Star recipient. I was there that night. I was one of the wounded you stayed with." The dining room seemed to fade around them. Margaret could hear the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the murmur of conversation from other tables, but it all seemed muted, like background music. She found herself looking into the face of this distinguished general and seeing traces of the frightened young soldier he had once been. "You held my hand," he said softly. "When the shelling was worst, you sat beside my stretcher and held my hand. You told me about your hometown in Ohio, about the apple trees behind your childhood home, and how they bloomed every spring without fail." Margaret remembered now, not his face, which had been so young then and marked by pain, but she remembered the conversation, the way he had gripped her fingers so tightly, the desperate need in his voice when he asked her to keep talking, to help him focus on something other than the fear. "I remember," she whispered. General Hayes stood up slowly, and Margaret realized that other conversations in the room had stopped. The other generals were watching now, along with the few remaining diners. He reached across the table and took both of her hands in his. "Lieutenant Margaret Mills," he said in a voice that carried across the silent room, "it is an honor to see you again." The words hung in the air, and Margaret felt tears building behind her eyes. She had spent so many years invisible, moving through her days without anyone knowing who she had been, what she had given. In the months since Harold's death, she had felt herself disappearing bit by bit, becoming smaller and quieter, until she wondered if she mattered to anyone at all. Here in this room filled with military officers, she was being seen, truly seen for the first time in years. General Hayes was still holding her hands, and his own eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Gentlemen," he said, turning to address the room, "I'd like you to meet a true American hero, Lieutenant Margaret Mills, Silver Star recipient. She saved my life and the lives of 2 other soldiers during an artillery attack on a field hospital in Vietnam." General Morrison stood up first, followed by General Patterson and then the others. Margaret found herself surrounded by these distinguished men, all of them rising to their feet in a gesture of respect she hadn't expected, never could have imagined. "Ma'am," General Morrison said with a formal nod, "it's an honor." The next few minutes passed in a blur of handshakes and respectful words. Margaret felt overwhelmed, but also strangely peaceful, as if something inside her that had been holding its breath for 40 years was finally able to exhale. When the crowd dispersed and she found herself alone again with General Hayes, he asked if she would join him at his table. She looked around uncertainly, but he gestured to the chair across from him with such genuine warmth that she couldn't refuse. "I need to hear your story," he said. "The real story. Not just what they wrote in the citation, but what it was really like." So Margaret sat down and began to talk about the fear she had felt that night.